Just very quickly, so I'm the other Jake talking tonight. The founder and president of an agency called 10up. We're a full service shop. We focus on making great experiences in digital for people that are creating content and telling stories on the web. And we are going to talk about dark mode. This is a short introduction, hopefully pretty focused, pretty tactical, pretty practical for what it means to support native OS level dark and light settings. At the risk of endless dad jokes, I'm going to try to keep this session light. Just do a few slides of jokes, get it out of my system. And so what is dark mode? Dark mode is somewhat obvious in its name, but the real implications here are that at the operating system level, at the OS level, most, and really we'll talk about this, all of the different major operating systems are starting to integrate native on-device support for different modes, different contexts for which you're viewing content. So you see in the screenshots, we have iOS, macOS, Android here. Really, we're talking about, at this point now in 2019, all of the major operating systems where people are experiencing content, having different contexts. For viewing content, support it. Android rolled it out in August 2018. I have that little asterisk because the number of devices that actually get Android 9.0 are pretty slim, so there is still a large number of devices that don't actually have full native on-device support, but it is supported in the OS as of last year. Last year's macOS update 10.14, back last September, added support for a native OS level dark mode, further enhanced this year by even turning on, adding in the just released 10.15 the ability to automatically toggle depending on the time of day, so it's getting more popularity. Windows 10, I don't really understand what Windows is doing with version numbering anymore. Version 1903? Is there 1,903 builds of Windows 10? Okay. Which was, I think, the release that came out earlier this year in June. I think they also call it like the summer 2019 update, added support natively for dark mode as a toggle. And then just recently, just a month and a half ago, iOS/iPad OS added native support for dark mode, and again, supports things like automatically toggling and has seen a lot of early adoption. So then, once the operating systems integrated support for it, the browsers, both at their own Chrome and UI level, no pun intended again, at their own wrapper level implemented support for dark mode. They also said, like, hey, maybe this is a property that we should standardize and pass along so that if we're going to support this, maybe the content that we're actually presenting should support it as well. So over the last couple of years, essentially all of the major browsers, or at least all the major browser engines, have added, as we'll get into, a native property that supports it. Chrome, Safari, Firefox, Microsoft Edge, I think their logo just changed, but I didn't want to use it. All have added support. You can go back and look at the version numbers, but basically for Microsoft and for Apple and Safari, it's tied to the OS releases that added support for dark mode. Chrome recently added support for both OSs. Firefox actually has it going back a little further. So we're really talking about you can reach a pretty broad audience. This is not like just a proprietary Safari thing for macOS dark mode and iOS. This is all of the different browsers, essentially all of the different major operating systems. So why support dark mode? Why does this matter? A few different reasons. First, I would posit its accessibility. So eye strain is a real thing. There's even people that have literally vision issues sometimes with this contrast and eye strain. Before we had official dark mode support in browsers and OSs, almost every major operating system going back 5 or 6 years had like that invert mode that you could turn on for people with vision difficulties. Even if you don't have an explicit difficulty, there are still contexts that I would consider accessibility where it's very hard to look at a very bright screen or conversely very hard to look at a dark screen. So I would posit part of this is accessibility. Personalization, or you could even think of this as a form of responsiveness. So the way that we think of responsiveness tends to be screen size support, but actually the intention of responsiveness is the notion that you are adapting to the device and the context of the device. Usually we take that to mean screen size. Sometimes that we take that to mean things like touch versus cursor interactions. I would say if you've turned your entire operating system into a dark mode or in a dark context, part of being responsive is adapting to that as well. It also can feel a bit more personalized. As we'll get into, we see a lot of positive feedback and reaction to it. It feels like you are creating a bit more of a personalized experience for your content, for that reader, which can create more engagement. As we'll get into later, it's also, and I don't use this word easily, it's also relatively easy, as we'll get into. This does not need to be a massive project that takes a year. We'll get into how you can pull it off with some CSS. If you want to get really fancy, a little bit of JavaScript. Doesn't take terribly long as a project. So just to give you some context for like showing this in action. So the client that we first did a big but easy dark mode project with was 9to5Mac, which we then rolled across all of their sites: Electric, 9to5 Google, 9to5 Toys. The reason we started with 9to5Mac is because they have people that really care about and know about all these OS features coming out and tend to read about these things and tend to get very excited when a new update comes out and they turn on dark mode and they see their site flip on. So here's the context of a full Mac OS screen in dark mode. You can see Twitter app responding, you can see Slack responding, you can see the whole OS kind of darkens, and then we're in a very bright room, but trust me, you're at night or you're in a context, you're looking at a dark screen, you suddenly load up one of these classic, very bright, very white space sites, and it can be somewhere between blinding and just frustrating to use as an experience. This is what it looks like afterwards. Feels like a site I want to spend some time on if I've got a bunch of tabs open, it's at night, and I'm trying not to go blind, want to sleep later. So I'll get into how to achieve it, but I think this gives a quick sense of like why putting a little bit in this effort, why when you think about the context of being in a darker room or at night looking at your screen, this can really draw someone in and make somebody want to spend more time, as opposed to like, I got to get out of here. The screen is overwhelmingly, my screen has suddenly got really bright. So how do you achieve dark mode? Believe it or not, it is not a bunch of like proprietary CSS for every single browser and OS. Somehow they managed to standardize this media selector. So just like other responsive media selectors where you define like browser width, there's a simple media selector that is called prefers color scheme. You can set it to dark or you can set it to light. And just like any other media selector, for those who have written CSS, you can then create overrides and patterns for that. So what that might look like in practice, very simple example, I may have somewhere above this media selector just like a body background equals white, text color equals black, create this media selector for dark, and we can set the background color to black and the text color to white. It's worth noting, because this is not always intuitively obvious, that you can also do the reverse. There is a media selector for light. Some sites that may prefer the default convention of their site, if you don't have an OS that supports it, if you haven't set this OS setting, may prefer that their site is by default dark, can actually choose to opt in, and if somebody has explicitly selected their OS to be in a light mode, do the reverse. So you can also have a dark default and then override in the reverse way if somebody has explicitly selected at OS level light. So that's the really basic CSS way of doing that. We'll come back to a couple other tips for making this easier and a couple things we learned along the way. But I also want to talk about the idea that using JavaScript, we can enable visitors to toggle dark mode. Get a little fancier here. So I'm going to, if the Wi-Fi will let me, do a quick showing of what this looks like, which I'll have to race through talking about. All right, so you see I'm in light mode on the page. My browser, my whole OS context, you can see the menu at the top and the bottom. I'm going into Control Center. I'm hitting that dark mode toggle on the bottom. I'm now refreshing the page. That's it. It switched into dark mode. Now you'll see this little in the top, it's a little bit blurry, there's like a little sun icon in the top menu bar. I'm tapping that, flips to light, tap it again, flips to dark. You'll see now that I've set it to dark, even if I go back in here, turn off dark mode, refresh the page, it stays in dark because I've explicitly now selected that my preference is the site in dark mode. All right, so the way that this works, just because I know that video went really fast, so by default, when the site gets loaded, we want to default, if it's available, to the operating system level setting. So if they haven't chosen an option, we check to see if the user has set for their operating system light or dark mode. And that is our default unless they manually interact and select an alternative mode. So they tap this button, which we'll talk about how we achieve in JavaScript. It's a standard bind to button kind of thing in JS. Once it's actually set into that mode, the OS will remember. the browser remember that setting. We use local storage in JavaScript so that it is saved persistently across that browser. If you go into dark mode, it will not use that local storage, but so long as you're on the same device, not in like a privacy mode, it'll keep that setting as you come back to the site time after time. So for the people that are a little technical, just a few slides with a little bit of code. So there is a property, or there's a method in JavaScript for the window called match media that can be used for any media selector. So you can also use this for like responsiveness to detect what the browser set to. So you can detect whether it prefers color scheme equals dark or prefers color scheme equals light. If you're looking for dark, you just use the matches method. This will basically tell you, yes, true, the browser is in dark mode. So I'm not going to walk you through like the entire script, but one key part of that script, if you're trying to do this in JS, is to use the match media method in JavaScript so you can detect at the JS level whether it's set to dark or light. This one's pretty straightforward. What we do is, again, sort of skipping over in your imagination some of the JavaScript. Once you've detected that, what we do is use a toggle at the body level of the document. We add a CSS property called dark mode activated. So in our actual CSS, we're not using that media selector. In the CSS, we just have a dark mode activated class applied to the body that we use to set all of our CSS. And then the last thing I want to highlight is we use the local storage method to save that property, which is how we detect when you come back what it's set to. There's a few advantages to local storage over using a cookie. It's actually faster performing. It doesn't actually have to communicate anything back and forth over HTTP. You don't have to set a timeout on the cookie. It's not necessarily, depending on how you set the cookie, limited to like that tab being open. So kind of a sidebar in this conversation, if you're still using local cookies and you're really using it to save those kind of settings, you should check out local storage methods, which all of the major browsers now support as well. So the reaction, usually you launch a new feature on a website and everybody wants you to go back and thinks you've done the worst thing ever and change their experience. One of the delightful things that I think speaks to how this small touch can really make an impact is they had, I think, something like 100 comments on this post within a few hours. Overwhelmingly, the sentiment is very positive. We're seeing people spend more time on the site that actually interact with that button. A lot of people, it's not in here, called out that like having it before their competitors actually made them choose, in some contexts, come back more often to this site as a preference. So total effort on the 10up side to get 5 sites. Now, mind you, they all have the same layout, but they do have different color schemes across each of the sites in their network. Total effort to get all of these sites, including the QA process, including some testing, all of about 30 hours. To roll this out across 30 sites. We're talking about a JavaScript button with a button binding that detects and toggles what the mode is, basically a body class for dark mode. And then you're talking about writing some CSS to change some colors and some layouts on the page. So pretty low effort for the impact that it has. A couple of just other tips for the road for people that are interested in implementing this. One is, the best example of this is images, but when you're thinking about dark mode and you're thinking about accessibility and you're thinking about that context, you should think more broadly than this is just like inverting the background color and the text color. Oftentimes images, if it's a predominantly designed to be bright and white site, can be very vivid on the page. So you can think about things like using that media selector or the class, if you go with the JavaScript method, using that media selector and doing things like setting the opacity on the images down to 80%, or using some of the other selectors even just to reduce brightness on more modern browsers. So probably other examples I'm not thinking of, but worth thinking about things like images and things on your page that might not just be as simple as flipping a switch, but can really have an effect if you're in a darker context on how you experience the page. Some other pro tips for the road. So one of the things that I thought was interesting that our developer pointed out who worked on this project is it actually sort of forced him to do a little bit of CSS cleanup on the page. So cleaner, less specific CSS makes it easier to maintain 2 modes. What this means in practice, as an example, is like if you've already set body color to black, you don't need to explicitly also set your heading 1 color to black and your say like body p tag color to black. The less specific you make your CSS, the more you let it inherit, which is a good CSS practice to begin with, the less time you're going to have to spend writing all of this new CSS that overrides all of those properties. So it sort of incidentally, even in 30 hours, led to some smart CSS cleanup that actually makes the site a little bit lighter, makes the site a little bit more maintainable. If you want to be Machiavellian about it for your team, it might just organically lead to some cleanup in the CSS. The other thing is if you're not using preprocessors like Sass, this is another good excuse to do that cleanup or get over to preprocessors like Sass. Being able to use variables when you create your CSS for things like here's my color palette, here are the dark background colors I want, here are the text colors that I want, and be able to plug those variable names in throughout the CSS. If that's already a huge help for people writing CSS, it is twice as helpful now when you're creating essentially two different color layouts for the page. Last tip, and this is more of a watch out for than a tip. It can be very tempting if you're just going quickly to like inverse colors. It can be very tempting to take a quick and easy approach that can lead, done sloppily in some of the examples that we looked at, to bad color contrast. And actually in dark mode, you may not be auditing the site for accessibility, but you could actually set your accessibility back. Odd link colors on top of certain backgrounds. So put thought into making sure you actually look at the accessibility of the site, test for the accessibility after you implement a dark mode. Be conscious that it's not necessarily as simple as just inversion of all colors. That's it. Question? Yeah.
Curious about what metrics you guys use to qualify the success of this and communicate that.
Yeah, so great question. We quantify the success with happy comments in the post. No. So it's still early to like be definitive. It is, oh God, I have to make this joke. It's not that black and white. How you measure it, because there's at any given time, including like this is right around the launch of a new operating system, there's a lot of metrics, like people just curious to play with it at the beginning as a new feature. What we can do, what we're trying to look at, is you can add a tracker to the button in something like GA to for one, measure how much of your audience is actually interacting with the button. You can also have some measurements tied to like the part of your audience that flips that button. How much time do they spend on the site? You can compare that to like somebody who never doesn't interact with the button. Not super clear, like clearly this is gaining us traffic of like 50%, but it does give you some indication at least afterwards of like, we wasted our time building this feature. No one cares, no one engages with it, or conversely, people seem to actually care and want to interact with it.
Similar question, can you track how many users are visiting the site currently in dark mode?
Good question. I don't know the answer. We aren't doing that. We aren't trying to track that. If I was trying to think off the cuff about that question, you could in JS use that. I guess you could use that you could use that method to detect whether they're in dark mode and send that back as a custom event to something like GA. Now that I'm thinking about it, maybe we should do that on the site. So there's probably a way, but we haven't implemented that. Most of it, what we're looking at is just interaction with the feature. So first, find a new designer. No. Yes, you could. I mean, the effort that you want to put into, I mean, clearly you could bring in a designer if you want to put a little bit more thought and effort into to how to make that come to life. The example of a very media-rich, very content-centric site is probably a little bit simplistic in the sense that, yes, if you're taking a site that is much more heavily designed, maybe has a lot of like scroll effects and scroll depth kind of interaction on the page, it's going to take more effort. You're probably going to want to involve a designer. It can, how to say this, like it can force some interesting conversations about application of brand, which isn't something I got into, how you handle transparency. And again, in a sort of Machiavellian way, probably good things you should be thinking about if you haven't already. So like, does your brand or your logo, for example, or your visual identity, does it work on a dark background? Like as dark mode started to proliferate on devices, or actually So everyone remembers like the Slack rebrand. Like one of the things they actually, if you read their full, like whatever you think of the rebrand, one of the things that they talked about in that brand story is like increasingly on devices and with customized customized displays of Slack, they're thinking that they're having to think about challenges like, does it work on a dark background? Does it work on a light background? So I took that a little bit sideways, but yes, if it's a more complex site, I'd encourage involving a designer. It may also expose in that process some interesting places where your brand doesn't organically work well in different kinds of contexts. I mean, you could. The media selector allows it. I would think more about like just reducing brightness of those images than like completely redesigning a new set of illustrations. So, good question. I don't have a clear answer.
In your example with the 95 Mac, when you search the colors, there was an ad there for like a Mac Pro, and it looked like that got converted. Is that like a transparent PNG, or do you actually replace the image?
We don't replace the ad. I'm not actually sure what was in it. May have been transparency behind the ad. It may have honestly just been luck of the draw when I refreshed the page and got a dark. I wonder. I actually, now that you're asking, I wonder if something's going on in the like on the DFP side where it's detecting context. That's something I'm gonna go look up later because I don't know if that was just lucky coincidence or if the ad stack layer is doing something. Yeah.
Great stuff.
Thanks.
I saw it as an accessibility piece too. And I don't know if you might have seen it, but do you think the accessibility, the standards groups are going to start picking this up and pushing forward, or are we kind of on the edge right now?
So the question is whether the standards group will pick this up and push for it. Your guess is as good as mine. They haven't historically made a big deal about contrast. I think they've, although it's interesting, right? Because one of the reasons I think they haven't is because historically this wasn't like a toggle. The way you solved for that accessibility issue was inversion of colors as an OS level setting, which would force basically all sites to work. Now that it's being implemented more at the choice level, you might see standards groups push this.
So before they hit the button,
Yeah.
their mode is controlled by the OS through the media selector.
Yes.
When they hit the button, then their mode is controlled by your cookie.
Local storage. Yes.
Sorry, local storage.
Yep.
Can they get back to OS controlled mode?
Great question. So the way we implemented it, the answer is no. I mean, you could clear your local storage. You could clear like that site's. There's a way in most browsers to say clear out all the properties and cookies and everything stored on the site, which would get you back there. We did actually think about that question. We said like, should there be like a three-way toggle, like light, dark, auto mode? The honest answer is for this particular client, they ultimately felt like we're overcomplicating it.
So you're going to then open source this or release this in some way to the general public?
I mean, honestly, yes, we have thought about just putting the. So don't get too deep in there. We could put it out there. We're willing to put it out there. I think the thing that's a little bit funny is like when I looked at, so I originally had a slide in here that's like cheat mode, like here's some plugins that do this. The thing that gets a little funny is what our thing that we open source would do is just give you a button to toggle adding a class to the body of your site. And there's sort of a question of like, does that, we could put like a gist on GitHub of like, here's the button toggle, but ultimately I'm giving you code for a button toggle that detects OS, a dark setting. It doesn't actually do anything to your site unless you know how to go in and then write a bunch of CSS to override the behavior. So yes, very open to it, but there is a little bit of a weird hovering question of like, what are we open sourcing that's actually useful? And people just get confused, like they expect to download the dark mode solution and nothing happens on their site when they turn it on. So yes.